Welcome back to Open BXRx. Pride Month is a celebration of the impact LGBTQ people have had in the world. The Bronx Defenders LGBTQ Defense Project is a dedicated team of advocates representing lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer residents in legal matters. Joining us now to discuss is Deborah Lolai of the LGBTQ Defense Project. Deb, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. To start, can you please tell us more about the LGBTQ Defense Project at Bronx Defenders?
Of course. The way I like to describe our project is it's using three different components of our work. So the first component of our work is direct legal representation. We are a team of lawyers and advocates who represent LGBTQ clients directly in a variety of different types of cases, such as criminal cases, prisoner rights cases, police misconduct cases, discrimination, immigration cases, housing, and family court cases. In addition to the direct legal representation, we also work on a variety of policy, legislative, and advocacy issues that impact our client population in all of the systems that I just mentioned. And we try to create policies that both keep them safe when they're navigating these systems, but also ensure that they are as respected as one can be while they are navigating these really difficult and challenging systems. And the third part of our project includes providing various types of training for the community, for city agencies, and other service providers to ensure that the service providers engage in best practices, and also that the community members know their rights when they're navigating these systems and working with these service providers.
Thanks, Deb, for breaking that down. I also wanted to discuss some of the disproportionate risks that low-income LGBTQ members face and how the LGBTQ Defense Project supports and advocates for the community.
Thank you so much. That's a really important question. I would say that in almost every facet of life, low-income LGBTQ people are disproportionately impacted. This is a result of both systematic oppression and discrimination, and also prejudice that people experience on an individual level. And I'm sure that you've already heard some of these statistics, but they are extremely jarring. And I'm talking about numbers like 40% of New York City's homeless youth identify as LGBTQ because of being rejected by their families. A large number of youth drop out of schools because of bullying and end up on the streets instead of in school. Nearly all transgender and gender nonconforming people have experienced discrimination in the employment sector and in housing, right? So they're not getting jobs, they're being denied housing because of who they are. And you know, when you talk about these risk factors, all of these factors lead to poverty, right? And so what this results in is a much higher percentage of LGBTQ people, in particular LGBTQ people of color, living in poverty. And we know that poor people, especially poor people of color, are targeted by the criminal legal system. And so it's no surprise that LGBTQ people of color are targeted by the legal system, both because they're living in poverty and also because of who they are, right? They experience disproportionate levels of profiling and harassment and discrimination by law enforcement. So, you know, what we do is we bring that reality that I just described into the courtroom. And we use that as a way to tell their stories and explain how they ended up where they're at and why they shouldn't be penalized for it, right? So not only do we try to highlight their lived experiences in defending them in their cases, but we also try to make efforts to do what we can to assist them in those in their lives, right? And that's sort of the whole idea of our holistic defense model. When we meet someone for the first time because they have a criminal case, it's not just their case that we work on. We work on the various struggles that they may be experiencing in their lives that may be a result of their case or may be what is resulting in them being arrested. So that's the type of work that we do. We try to, we work on both the risk factors that result in people ending up in the system, and also trying to bring light to what people's lives look like, right? And why they look like that.
And I love that that's the process, because sometimes maybe even the client is not aware of all these structural things being put in place to stop them from advancing in their own communities. So, on top of that, the discrimination for just being who they are is just an attack on humanity in itself. So I'm very glad that this resource is here for them. Next, I wanted to discuss, I can't help but reflect on how Pride Month and LGBTQ resistance and the community's history of protests are reminiscent of protests that are happening nationally today. Deb, can you speak to us about the solidarity of the LGBTQ community with current Black Lives Matter and anti-police brutality movements?
Definitely. I think this is a conversation that a lot of people are having right now. And, while I think it's a huge misconception that LGBTQ people started fighting for their rights when Stonewall happened. That's just not true. LGBTQ people have been fighting for their rights throughout history, way before Stonewall happened. However, the Stonewall uprising was the moment in which we started to, as a country, celebrate Pride every year, right? And I think it's important. That's important because the Stonewall uprising was literally an uprising against police brutality, right? It was an uprising that was led by trans and gender nonconforming women of color who were resisting police brutalization of their lives, their bodies, their communities, right? And that's what we're seeing today too, right? And sadly, while the LGBTQ community has made a lot of progress in terms of their rights more broadly in this country, the targeting of LGBTQ people of color by law enforcement has largely remained the same from the time of Stonewall. Not much has changed, right? And the NYPD continues to profile LGBTQ people, specifically trans and gender nonconforming people. They continue to harass them, abuse them, and kill them. And it doesn't end there. It doesn't end with the NYPD. The jails and prisons do the same thing, right? Layleen Polanco, a transgender woman of color who died in the custody of the Department of Correction, would be alive today if she were not transgender, right? She would not have been placed in solitary confinement if she were not transgender. And it's important to remember that, right? Because we need to keep in mind how this movement began. We need to keep in mind who has benefited from this movement and who continues to be deprioritized in the movement. And we need to change that. We need to change the focus of Pride, of LGBTQ rights more broadly, and hone in on the people who are being the most impacted, the worst, the discriminated against in the worst way, whose lives are literally being taken from them because of who they are. So I do think that because of that history and what's happening right now, I think that naturally there is a solidarity that is building, and it's an important one, right? We need to have that solidarity in order to keep this momentum and movement sustainable.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Deb. I also wanted to bring up that the LGBTQ Defense Project also fought in the beginning of the pandemic for the release of transgender vulnerable inmates amid coronavirus. Were your calls heard, and are there any updates on this?
No, I would say our calls have not been heard. They have not been responded to. Transgender, gender nonconforming, intersex, and non-binary people who are locked up in our city jails and our state prisons continue to be the most targeted. They continue to be the most at-risk population within the jails and prisons, and not nearly enough is being done to ensure that they are released. We have clients who are in their late 60s, who suffer from chronic medical issues, who are transgender, and they are still sitting at Rikers Island. And there are so many nuances to this issue that might not be as apparent to people who are not entrenched in the system, and because they're not so obvious, right? So for example, the sort of incompetency of these agencies result, and not just incompetency, also discrimination, right? And violence in which they process individuals also results in this. So when a transgender person goes into custody, there's often a big question about where to place that person, right? And as a result of that, they're often moved around from unit to unit, housing area to housing area, facility to facility. And that results in them having contact with way more people and way more spaces than a cisgender person would, right? Solely because of who they are or how they're perceived. The other issue is that people are nervous right now. Incarcerated people are nervous, and that naturally results in an uptick in tension and uptick in violence. That coupled with the reality that many correction officers are not coming to work because they want to keep themselves safe, understandably, means that there's also less monitoring in these facilities. So the people who are the most vulnerable to violence are the ones who are going to be preyed upon. And that is almost always transgender people, especially transgender women who are currently locked up in men's jails and prisons.
It's really hard to move on to a more positive side of things in the movement, but for the sake of time, I have to continue on. But hearing that is just heart-wrenching in and of itself. So thank you for sharing that. I also wanted to ask about a momentous civil rights law that finally protects gay and transgender workers from workplace discrimination. This is, of course, a great victory for the LGBTQ community, but the fight for equality and rights is not over. What's next, Deb?
I think one of the most beautiful parts of this moment in history right now is that it gives us space and an opportunity to vision a world that we may have not been able to envision previously. And so I think we have a lot more work to do, and it's already happening, right? But you're right. The recent victory was so crucial, and it was actually transgender people who were on the front line of that case, and who made that happen. So again, right, we see transgender people leading the way for the benefit of the larger community, but we cannot forget who continues to be forgotten, right? I say this all the time. It's great when laws are passed to protect our rights, but actually it doesn't end there. What happens next is even more important. Those laws need to be implemented. People need to follow those laws. Employers need to stop discriminating against trans and gender nonconforming people. And when they do, they need to be held accountable, right? And so that's sort of the next step in this specific regard, but we have a lot more work to do across the board, right? Our LGBTQ immigrant population are suffering right now. LGBTQ people of color who are living in poverty in New York City across the board are suffering. We need to do things that directly impact transgender nonconforming women of color, like decriminalize sex work. There's a bill right now on the state level that would decriminalize sex work or repeal a certain section of the penal law that would do that in part. And people need to know that that kind of thing is happening, and we need to be pushing for it. So there's a lot more work to be done, right? And it's inextricably tied to the larger uprisings that are happening in our country right now.
Thank you for that, Deb. Just before we go, how can the community reach out to Bronx Defenders and receive support and also donate to the LGBTQ Defense Project?
Well, we have a 24-hour hotline. If you have an issue that you think you would benefit from talking to an attorney about, the number to that hotline is 347-778-1266. You can call any day at any hour, and you'll be able to speak with an attorney. You can also email our project directly at lgbtqdefense@bronxdefenders.org. And if you want to donate to the Bronx Defenders, you can visit our website at www.bronxdefenders.org, and you'll see a donate button right on the website.
Thank you so much for your time today, Deborah, and for the wealth of knowledge that you provided us today.
Thank you so much.
Of course. Folks, for more information, please visit bronxdefenders.org and follow at Bronx Defenders on Instagram to stay in touch. Open BXRx will be right back.